Edward Rutherfurd's Russka, the novel of Russia, is unlike any history or historical novel I've ever read. While it's not uncommon for stories to be set in particular times and places, with genuine attempts at historical accuracy, what is distinct about Rutherfurd's approach is that the story is not about a single period in history, nor is it about any particular characters, but is instead a series of stories about different characters from different time periods, all revolving around a single place. While telling a narrative that spans over generations is not uncommon for history books, one would think it almost impossible to do this with a novel. That said, the stories presented are quite cohesive and tell Russia's history in perhaps the best way possible, by showing, not telling. Using a television series as an analogy, one could consider this similar to the British series Blackadder, where various characters from different eras interact with different periods while sharing a common theme. But while Blackadder is comedic, Rutherfurd is very serious and honest in the way he represents the history of Russia. As far as teaching people history, this approach is perhaps a bit more effective than the traditional history book. While most history books will give you a kind of narrative, Rutherfurd tries to give you human examples where their stories are the perfect fit for the historical nuances you would otherwise miss. While this book is not a book about Ukraine, like most Russian history books, it mentions territories that Ukraine would consider Ukrainian. In the chapter Cossacks, it even refers to the territory of Ukraine as Ukraine. However, the book is primarily a Russian history book, therefore the book looks to define these locations based on how they relate to Russian history. For someone interested in Ukrainian history, this is not an uncommon problem, as Russians and Ukrainians are diverging states that have entangled histories. As such, many Ukrainian cities are referred to by their Russian names and are presented as part of Russia's history. So you have Kiev instead of Kiev. However, as this novel is quite long, it had a time to discuss the various political movements that occurred throughout Russia's history. As such, it didn't fail to mention Ukraine's independence movement, and even featured a Ukrainophile character named Karpenko, who follows in the footsteps of Shevchenko and dreams to write stories about the Cossacks and the Ukrainian language. At the time, the Ukrainian language had been banned, so this is something of a statement. Karpenko serves as perhaps a token Ukrainian figure. By his own words, when questioned by Russians, he states that he is loyal to the Tsar, but the book doesn't fail to mention at least a few of the various factions during the Ukrainian Civil War of 1917 to 1922. Nor does it seem to villainize Ukraine. In fact, it might even villainize Russia. Reading the book, one doesn't come across the impression that Russia is entirely a morally consistent entity. Read about Ivan the Terrible torturing a priest by tying him to a bear and then throwing a baby who he believes was the priest's child off a roof. We read about Catherine the Great idolizing Voltaire, but we also read about her worrying about the effects of Voltaire on her own population. So you have some hypocrisy where she's willing to accept some ideals, but she's not willing to grant those same rights to her own population. Something that would later come into effect with the Decembrists, who eventually revolt. We also read about how Peter the Great idolized war to the expense of everything else, and how he planned to steal technology from the West, borrow technology and then use it against the West. We also don't get an idealized vision of the Bolsheviks either. In the story, we read how they enacted a coup after rejecting the results of an election. Indeed, the book may be somewhat romanticized, but it's not, to the best of my detection, propaganda. So, if you're new to Russian history and prefer stories to hard facts, this might be one of the more interesting ways to learn. If you feel I misrepresented something Rutherfurd said, feel free to comment. I had to rush through this book because it was so long. I felt I might have missed something. But if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe. I'm doing this for educational purposes, so any comments are welcome in the comment section. Thank you.